Let's talk radio. Kyle Sandilands is demanding the reinstatement of his $100 million contract with ARN, claiming he did not breach it, while co-host Jackie O expresses heartbreak over her unexpected departure, clarifying she did not resign. So was it a publicity stunt? Let's ask Darren Woolley from Trinity P3. What's going on?
Well, Aaron, you'd think it is a publicity stunt because they're well known over the 20-odd years that they've been broadcasting together to have one stunt after another. They'll do anything to get ratings, even step over the broadcasting guidelines. But here's the thing, they keep reframing this as if it's an employment issue, that somehow, Kyle and Jackie have been fired by their employers. We've got to remember this is a $200 million contract. $100 million for each of their companies, which they've signed as directors of those companies and entered into an arrangement to provide these services. Now, if this has gone horribly wrong, it's not going to be played out in Fair Work Australia. This is going to go to court, and it's going to be really interesting how that turns out. Because if it was an employment contract, the behaviour that we saw on air, with him being so aggressive and abusive towards her, which he's done many times before, just wouldn't cut it in a workplace these days.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned that. Obviously, we've seen the statement now from both of them, and it's fascinating. It all began with horoscopes, and it kicked off. It sounds like Kyle was having a particularly bad morning that day. A former producer, EP of the show, once told me that they plot everything out 3 weeks in advance. What are the chances this is just one giant ruse?
Well, and I think that's possibly what's happened. It could be a giant ruse, and if it is, it's gone horribly wrong because they've played into the hands of ARN management in some ways. They've got this agreement, $200 million worth. That agreement is now worth more than the company itself. I mean, the ARN has been dropped from the ASX 200 because the market cap has now dropped below the threshold to be on the top 200. And so, you can think that the management was probably sitting there thinking, how can we actually get out of this or at least minimise the risk? Because the expansion into Victoria, the idea was we'll sign this $200 million contract with them to expand nationally. Well, Victoria hasn't worked. I think were rating 5% before they were taken off air. This could be management trying to mitigate the disaster that seems to be happening, which is that they're not popular around outside of Sydney. And so, if that's the case, it could end up costing them a lot of money and they may have to backpedal, or maybe they'll use it to tear up those contracts and sign new ones. They've already said they've offered one to Jackie. So I'm wondering if Kyle's going to have to come to the party too.
Yeah, it's really interesting. This term remedy, I'm no lawyer, but I've signed a few contracts both as an employee and as an employer. And this idea that they need to remedy the situation, what do you read into that? Because to me, that sounds like a really grey area. So he's been told on the one hand, he's not able to contact Jackie O, which does sound like something you'd tell an employee when there's an investigation into bullying or harassment or something like that underway. But then on the other hand, we're seeing headlines that they're back in contact, they're a united front, they want their show back, and therefore that is the remedy to the situation. Do you see that maybe Michael Stevenson, Steve-O, the new head, of course, of ARN, is essentially trying to say the agreement in the past does not work for us financially. If you get your show back, you will do so, but not at that price.
Yeah, and that could be the case. They could have played into his hands. If you're right and they planned this out weeks ago, they've probably set themselves up. There's a lot of nuance in here that only lawyers can really talk about. Remedy, though, is you're meant to make good. If you're in breach of your contract, they'll give you a period of time, 14 days, to actually make good on that and make sure that that breach has been rectified. And then to say, but you can't talk to the other party, but they have separate contracts, and that's the other complication here, is that there's one with Jackie's company and one with Kyle's company. It's not like they're joint signatories to this agreement, which means that at any time, if one of them pulled out, it leaves the other one, depending on the contract, hanging.
Well, Jackie O kind of kicked this off by storming out, not wanting to come to work the next couple of days, which you can understand. She was really pushed pretty strongly by Kyle, and you could argue humiliated publicly. That's nothing new for the show, but if this were an employee situation, there would be big trouble there. It's interesting you mentioned that about that side too. If you were to look into your crystal ball, how do you see this one panning out before we move on?
Well, I think the other thing ARN are going to have to play is how will this actually play with advertisers? Because, to pay for this contract, no matter what it turns up, advertisers are going to have to start saying, do we really want to be associated with a brand, a show, a content, two personalities that are so disruptive? Of course, they'll go where ratings are, but ARN's got a really complex Gordian knot here that I don't see being quickly solved.
Yeah. All right, let's move on, because trust in B2B marketing is less about earning and more akin to a loan. This is according to Darren Woolley, who, now I want you right now to explain what you mean by that, the complexities of what is, I guess, a misunderstood dynamic. What do you see as trust being a professional line of credit these days?
Okay, so Dentsu, the Japanese advertising company that's global, brings out every year.
They bought Harold Mitchell's company, didn't they?
Indirectly, yes.
Right, yep.
Indirectly they did. It was sold to Aegis, and then they bought Aegis, which then became part of Dentsu Media. But they bring out, their B2B arm brings out a thing called the Superpower Index for business-to-business advertising. And one of the big insights that came out was that trust has become such an important part in B2B relationships. And it's interesting because it's one of those words that everyone talks about. So I started reflecting on when we run a lot of tenders where major marketers choose advertising agencies as their partners. And often there'll be this disagreement in that people will say, well, trust is something that's earned, and so you appoint the agency and then they have to earn it. And others will say trust is something that's given during that tender process. Well, in actual fact, I believe it's neither of those, because no one, of course, would appoint a potential supplier business partner unless they trusted them. But how could you actually trust someone that you've only possibly been interacting with 2 or 3 months? And so what I'm saying is that in any sort of new business relationship, there's this thing of, I'm going to give you trust that you're going to deliver what I need, but I'm doing it as a loan. You have to pay it back, and you have to pay it with interest in the first 6 months or 12 months or whatever length of the contract is. Because here's the thing, if you don't, as the vendor that's successful, if you don't pay it back in time for the contract renewal, it's highly unlikely you're going to keep that contract rollover. And I think it makes an interesting dynamic, because this idea of trust is often nebulous and something that we throw around. But to think of it as a loan, and now how do you pay back that trust loan? Well, transparency, responsiveness, and actually proving the value that you're bringing to that relationship every single day. And it's a new way of thinking about the way we do business with each other.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way of putting it, because it's about that fluidity, right? And as you say, two people in a business organisation trusting each other and coming together can very much change. This isn't a marriage signed at a registry office that till death do you part. It can change very quickly. And what you mentioned there about some of the things that have to happen, the conditions, one thing is about delivery as well, making sure that the delivery actually happens as stated in the contract, right?
Yeah, reliability. And look, the big test of any trusted relationship is a disaster. When something goes wrong, the way you respond as the vendor or the supplier is so important as a way of paying back that trust. That's really the test of, are you up to this paying back this loan?
Yeah, it's a wonderful way of putting it. So the differing views among agency heads regarding how trust is earned, what would you say about that?
Oh, look, there are many that think that they're such great performers in a pitch that the client has absolutely bought everything that they've said and they're totally trusted. And I often say to myself, it's either arrogance or you're deluding yourself, because there's no way. They have to have some belief that you can deliver what you say you're going to do. But I don't think anyone ever, and even in personal relationships, you may find that someone could be trustworthy, but do you actually trust them at face value? I don't think so. It has to be proven, and that's the payback.
All right, Darren Woolley, always appreciate your insights. Trinity P3. We'll talk to you again soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Ahron.